Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for a kind invitation. This is the second time I'm in Latvia. The first time was in January, and minus 23. So I'm now happy that it's about 40 degrees warmer than it was last time I was here. I think my approach to economics is different for a couple of reasons. One reason is that before I took my PhD in economics, I went to Harvard Business School. And what you do at Harvard Business School is that every day for 2 years, you study 3 cases of actual businesses. And you get some kind of artificial experience of what the world really, how the world really works. I also work with in Latin America, in development economics. I've in fact worked in more than 50 different countries, either as a businessman. I used to run a manufacturing company which produced in 3 European countries for 19 years, and then I came back to economics. So, in a sense, I have been out in the real world there and found that there are certain things which are very important, which are not captured by tools of economics. Economics today tends very much to be defined as seeing the world through a set of tools. And these tools have some blind spots. One of them is financial crisis. Financial crisis cannot happen in theory, they can only happen in practice. And now I think we are in the beginning of the continuation of the financial crisis that started in 2008 and we never managed to solve. We're into round 2. And the second big blind spot is that this theory doesn't recognize why some nations are rich and some are poor. And the very simplistic reason for that, the simple explanation, is that in economic theory, neoclassical economic theory, all economic activities are qualitatively alike. If you assume that washing the floor in the hospital is the same kind of job as being the head surgeon of the hospital, well, then you miss something. Right? Because the country, if you put all the people who are surgeons in Latvia in one country and all the people who wash the floors of the hospitals in another country, well, you get one. You don't get factor price equalization as the economists think. You get factor price polarization. Some specialize in being poor, as the previous speaker put it. I think before I get into the subject of the day, which is state-owned companies and what to do with them, I think we have to discuss this in a setting. And I think the quote here from Strauss-Kahn is a very appropriate one, and I think also the comments of my previous speaker was very appropriate. I don't know if you remember where you were on the 30th of April 2004. I remember where I was. I was in the Tallinn Opera House, and it was a big party because the next day Estonia and Latvia would join the European community. And everyone was happy because, not only were you as countries out of the claws of the Soviet Union, you were into a new club, the club of the rich, European Union. I remember I sat there and said, well, what is really going on? And I said, well, I think I'm participating in a funeral. This is the funeral of the European welfare state as it used to be. It's the beginning of something new, but that something new is going to be very different from what Europe thought it would be. Strauss-Kahn said that some myths are gone. And the myths that are gone were the very foundations of the ideology of the European Union. The Maastricht Treaty was born in a situation where everything could only go forward and the biggest problem we could have was inflation. So they made a treaty trying to prevent inflation. You could take a lot of things for granted. An Estonian colleague of mine and we wrote a paper in 2004 where we said, it was called the Latin Americanization of Europe. And we presented that in a conference in Rio, in Brazil. And what did we mean by Latin Americanization? Well, we meant that, first of all, the difference between rich and poor are going to be much bigger. And geographically, the rich and the poor are going to come more closely together. You know, the distance from the rich quarters in Rio to the favelas where the poor live is a couple of kilometers. So we tried to make an index. And we said, how far do you have to travel from the heart of the city, where you can rent an apartment for a month? How far do you have to travel to be able to buy a whole house for the rent, for 1 month's rent? Right? That kind of McDonald index. And we find that in Norway, that was about 2,000 kilometers. From Oslo, if you take the monthly rent of a good apartment in Oslo, and you go to Vardø, the furthest northeast in Norway, you can actually buy the whole house for the monthly rent. So that, Norway, 2,000 kilometers. We tried to do the same thing in Estonia, and it came to 60 kilometers. Flat central Tallinn to buying a whole house for the monthly rent of flat, 60 kilometers. I don't know if you wanted it here. But that's just a measure of the new kind of wealth and poverty that we face. We wrote another article in 2006. We can find these on the internet. And we said, European integration and attempted economic suicide, question mark. And now I'm going to take away the question mark. Well, what essentially happened? Well, Europe, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, you had the integration of Spain into Europe. Spain had an inefficient industry. Spanish industry got 10 years to get efficient. They lowered the tariffs, the high tariffs that Spain had, by 10% for 10 years, and they had all kinds of support to keep Spanish industries alive, and it was very successful. Very successful gradual integration in the theory of Friedrich List, the German economist. Well, what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall? You had a shock therapy, and before the industries in the former Soviet Union even knew their costs in a free market, they were bankrupt. So you had a tremendous deindustrialization of Eastern Europe. And after that tremendous deindustrialization, you get an opening to the EU. And here we have to look at, how different economic areas have sorted out their problems. In the United States, you have a huge market, you have one currency, you have one fiscal policy with some regional some variation between states. But if something goes poorly, if the auto industry in Detroit, Michigan is in trouble, Michigan cannot devalue. So people move, right? People move from Michigan to Alabama or somewhere. And prices of houses in Detroit fall by 50%, 70%, and the system adjusts. This is not the way we used to have it in Europe. In Europe, we had a different system. We had free trade for the last 30 years or so. And when a nation had a problem, it devalued. Italy used too much money. Italy got into a lot of debt. But the Italian debt was in Italian lira. So what Italy could do then was to devalue. So it devalued by 20%, it cut its debt by 30%, it cut its wages by 20% compared to the rest of the world, and Italian industry became competitive. Right? So we had, instead of a flexible population, we had a flexible exchange rate. Right? So, but you have to choose. So what Europe has done now, with some very good exceptions like Poland, Sweden, and Iceland, who are all doing well because they have their own currency, and England to some extent, which has devalued massively, we're now saying, no, we keep the exchange rate. But what we don't say, but which implicitly has to happen, is that if you keep the exchange rate fixed and you don't do anything, when a country gets into problem, you have to move the people. So what we have done is that we have created the American model without knowing it. So what's going to happen now in Greece, if they don't devalue, Greek industry becomes terribly uncompetitive and people have to move to Germany. But this is not what the Germans want, and this is not what the Greeks want. Right? And Latvia is, in a sense, has the same kind of problems. And always, when you have these problems, it's the people that you least want to leave that leave. The ones with the most initiative, the most entrepreneurial, the ones who should have stayed behind and created new businesses, they leave and go abroad. This is a problem in Latvia, but it's also a problem in Europe in general. We came out of an idea created during the Cold War that something that was the two utopias. I call them the two utopias. One is that the market is bad and that the state solves all problems. The other is the other way around, that the state is bad and market solves all problems. Right? So we went from one extreme to the other. But historically, both these assumptions are equally silly. There's always been a mixture of state and private. And these things, in a way, challenge the right-left axis. So some countries that are considered to be being to the right actually have very leftish policies. General Pinochet of Chile, I'm sure you would not consider him a leftist. But he recognized that the big cash cow in the Chilean economy were the coal mines, the state-owned coal mines, Lattelekom. Right? So, in spite of all his neoliberal rhetoric, Pinochet never touched Lattelekom. You don't give away the family silver. I may believe in the market, but I'm not stupid. Right? This is Pinochet. He took away tariffs on many industries, but about after a year and a half, he understood, hey, we need some industries. We can't close down our industries, so he put the tariffs back. So it's a matter of people who are liberal, but understand the difference between rhetoric and reality. They have the rhetoric, but the reality is completely different. And other people who buy the rhetoric completely and think that the rhetoric is the reality. The Americans used to say, don't do as the English tell you to do as the English do. Because the English said free trade for everything, and really what they had was a very protectionist system. I think now we should say, don't do what the Americans tell you to do like the Americans do. And what do the Americans do? Well, the Americans have set up a lot of state-owned venture capital firms. Would you believe that CIA, FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security all have their venture capital funds? Because they all need high-tech instruments. If you are the Homeland Security people, well, you want a system to check trucks on the Mexican borders. Well, then you need a gigantic X-ray, which can X-ray whole trucks, Well, how do you do that? Well, you don't set up a company, but you set up a venture capital fund which buys the shares of small companies that can do that. So actually what's happening in the United States, under the radar, you know, there is a rhetoric out there which is very different from what's going on. So I think we could call it under the radar, that under the radar there's a lot of very intelligent industrial policy going on. And I think here is where, where things can be learned also for Latvia. And I think we have to see what is the definition of capitalism. Is capitalism only a free trade? Is capitalism some kind of railway station where goods meet? No, capitalism has to do with production. And the going definition of capitalism before World War II was that capitalism consists of three things. The entrepreneur, the capitalist. You know, how can you have capitalism without capitalists? I think this is something that small countries like Estonia and Latvia also have to think about. You know, where are your capitalists? Because they are the foundations of capitalism. The modern state and the technology system. Right? And neoclassical theory and the neoliberal rhetoric that's flawed, that was seen as flawed, didn't consider neither the entrepreneur, nor the modern state, nor the technological system. And I think the last speaker, in his recommendations, you know, brought these factors back in a very nice way. So what we're seeing now is, in a sense, a fight between financial capitalism and production capitalism. We have to recognize that these two are entirely different beasts. In good times, there is a financial sector which provides capital to the production economy. Right? So finance is kind of a bridge in time. If you want to build a factory or a house to last for 50 years, you go to the financial sector, and the financial sector provides it. In bad times, well, we say to the financial sector, you can create as much money as you want. Because this is what we're essentially saying to the banks. You know, what the banks do is create money. You say, okay, go ahead and create money. And we used to say, well, carry those risks on your balance sheet, and if you give that money to the wrong people, you lose it. Right? Now we say, okay, we can create as much money as you want, but if you give it to people like subprime loans or to countries that can't pay, don't worry, just send the bill to the production economy. Right? And this is where the problem is. And Schumpeter, who was Joseph Schumpeter, an Austrian Harvard economist, used to say that you must never save the financial economy, because if you save them once, they will think this is so great, so that they go ahead and do the same thing once again and say, please save us again. You know, we saved the financial sector from their disasters in the private economy, and now we have a problem of the financial crisis in public economy, and we used all the resources. So now when the crises are coming again, we don't have the resources. So I think we're in for some tough times. State enterprises historically were not enemies of private. State enterprises came into existence because nations wanted to have certain industries, like we heard in the case of Norway recently, or 2 generations ago, iron and steel industry. So if you wanted an industry, you put up some tariffs, and you said, if you set up an industry, you get, you know, tax rebate for 10 years or whatever. If no business came, he said, oh, well, if nobody wants to do it, I'll have to do it. So the state was the entrepreneur of last resort. The state went in and became owner of a business that people saw as important, but the risk was too big for the private sector to handle it. Now this was how it was born. Other reasons where it was born was because it was strategic. Would you believe it, that baking bread in Prussia in the late 19th century was a state-owned enterprise? Because it was considered so strategic. Why was bread strategic? Well, you needed it for the army. You needed it to feed the people. So what is strategic varies from one setting to another. But the fact is still there that public companies are considered strategic. So state ownership is a tool for industrial policy. And normally the setting has been, well, this is a high-risk business. Here is where we can have some clusters, as the last speaker was saying. So if we just can get this core of the cluster going, then we'll have a lot of very good spin-offs. Why did Norway, Sweden, and Denmark get together in 1949 to build an airline? Well, they understood in order to compete with American companies, we need an airline. You know, the nations are too small. Let's go together and create this airline. So there was a very good reason in 1949 to have a state-owned airline. I think now in Scandinavia, that's no longer the case. I think mature companies, the state should sell out. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be state involvement in the Latvian airline, in Air Baltic, you know. All these things are always context specific. Right? So the strategy for state ownership has to be context specific. In the Washington Consensus folly, as in a sense I like to call it, what happened was that private monopolies were in the name of competition were privatized. Oh, we have to create some competition, so let's privatize a monopoly and keep it a monopoly. You know, if you saw through the rhetoric, it was not very intelligent to do. Argentina, which is not Latvia, got out of a financial crisis in a very creative way because they devalued. But on the road, they also had to sell out their phone company. The Argentine phone company was bought by Telefonica of Spain, and it was a huge investment. You know how long it took for Telefonica to get their money back? A year and a half. This was like privatization in Russia, where a Norwegian commentator was saying, you can get a huge state company in Russia, you can buy it for the price of a villa in Oslo. You know, dirt cheap. And this is what's happening. There are people out there who are looking at this as an opportunity to get very important assets dirt cheap. You know, the financial speculators. So, what you're doing, in a sense, in the crisis, is that it's similar to what the farmers would be doing if they were selling their seed potatoes. You know, you're hungry and you eat the seed potatoes for next year, and next year you don't have any potatoes. You know, I urge you in Latvia not to do that. Don't sell this off. Don't sell off your seed potatoes. Use the little tools that you have left for industrial policy in a creative way. This is happening also in the United States. Rob Johnson is a former speculator. He used to run a fund for Soros, for George Soros. And I think these days we should listen more to the speculators because they understand what's going on than we should listen to the economists. There's a saying in English that if you want a good game warden, you need to hire somebody who has been shooting animals illegally, because the people who have been shooting animals illegally know the business, and they are the people who should be put up as game wardens. Right? And this is the same thing here. You know, the people who used to make a lot of money on speculation and understand now that it's ruining the world economy, they are the ones we should listen to. And Soros is one of them. And Soros' former companion who now wrote something which is called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which is sponsored by Soros. He says that there are a lot of people out there looking for the opportunity of picking the bones of the American public economy. He uses the metaphor of a vulture coming in at an opportunity and picking the bones and getting all the good meat off the public company in the United States in a situation of distress. I think this is worrying because what's happening in Europe reminds me more and more of what happened in Russia. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a shock therapy in Russia, and as I said before, the Russian companies knew their cost structure; they were bankrupt and could be sold off easily. And one of the men behind this was a Swedish economist by the name of Anders Aslund, and Mr. Aslund now works for a conservative think tank in Washington, and he's just come out with a book, How Latvia Came Through the Financial Crisis. And Latvia is and the internal devaluation in Latvia, the fall in real wages, is in this man's view the solution for the rest of Europe. I think these are very, very dangerous thoughts. We know that democracy came to Russia with the fall of 50% in real wages. So to many Russians, democracy means halving of real wages. We're not aware of that in Western Europe. I spent a lot of time in Russia last year working on it, and I've seen it happen before in Latin America. In Latin America, there was a massive deindustrialization starting in the late 70s. Real wages were halved, but it doesn't show up that much in GDP because the profit margins are going up. So that the financial sector, the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate takes over what used to be wages. And I think if you look at what happened in Latvia, wages went down and profits went up. And I'm not against profits, but I think the basic job of capitalism is to produce a decent living for people. And now all over the Western world, the decent, decent living is disappearing in the margin. I was in Italy last week, at the beach, in this country, in the resort next to Portofino, Santa Margherita, which is a very plush resort. And I sit there at the bench and, listening to what people are saying, to the old ladies behind me, and they said, well, what are you going to cook for Sunday? Says one. And the other said, well, I have some ravioli, but now since I couldn't pay the electricity bill and I don't have a refrigerator anymore, it's very difficult. And it was 36 degrees in the shade. We have these problems all over the world. It's not only Latvia. 25% of all children in California, in the state of California, are on some food program, what the Americans used to call food stamps. So the illusion has broken, and I think it's time to try to mend the fences and to try to save what can be saved. The former speaker was talking about naivete. In a sense, it is a bit like that. Well, because business is pretty rough. As far as I understand, what happened to the Latvian sugar industry is that it was closed down, and buy sugar from Denmark in the name of the free market. Well, sugar is a crazy business. There is only one country in the world which doesn't lose money producing sugar, and that's Brazil. All the others are losing. Well, okay, let not only Denmark lose money on producing sugar, let Latvia create some jobs by losing money on sugar as well. I think this is the attitude you should take. This has nothing to do with profit. This is the way of sucking money out of the European Union. And by the way, I think that a lot of the problems now in the Baltic countries is being covered up. I think the statistics are strange. I think a lot is covered up by regional funds from the EU. You close down your industries and we give you some subsidies. And that's not very healthy. So my recommendations are just in the line of the last speaker. Use these state-owned firms as basis for clusters, of high-tech clusters, because that is the only way you can get out of the problems. Latvia used to be a colony of Russia, of the Soviet Union. Well, now in a sense you're becoming, like many other countries, the colonial periphery of Europe, Roman Empire, somebody says. I don't know if it's better to be a colony of Sweden than to be a colony of Russia, perhaps. Perhaps it is. If you look at what Finland was a colony of Sweden in the 1600s, and that was very nasty. But if you go to Estonia, who was a colony of Sweden 100 years later, the Estonian saying for the good old days, when they want to say that, they say the good old Swedish days. Because that was during the Enlightenment, and people were enlightened, the serfs were freed, and it was a good period, right? Now, I think we are in a period where being a colony of Sweden is not as good as it was in the good old days in Estonia. In Latin America, they're saying that the Spanish multinationals are much worse than the Americans. You think they come from Europe, and you think they're nicer, but they're not. They're much more head-nosed and tough. And if you have somebody trying to regulate an Argentinian phone company, and the annual salary of the employee who is going to regulate the telephone company is 10 days of a salary of the man running the telephone company, you're never going to get good regulation. Forget it. They're power relationships. So I think the task of the periphery of Europe, who do you want to be a colony for, is a difficult one. But I think the lesson now from Greece and other countries is that perhaps the euro is functioning like the gold standard in the 1930s, which kept the depression going because you couldn't print money. You make something very rigid. Markets are very useful because they provide flexibility. Why on earth would you take out the flexibility of exchange rates? Why do the people who love markets remove markets where they're the most useful? This makes very little sense. So there's some sad times for the world economy. There's some sad times for Europe. But after the financial crisis, I think the Latvia is no longer alone. In Spain, the youth unemployment is 40%. Spaniards are leaving. So it's a meager consolation, but you're no longer alone. The problem that used to be kind of a Baltic-Latvian problem is now a much bigger problem. And don't think that the high-tech things in Estonia have solved all the problems. My university there, we share the main office with Skype, the telephone companies. Skype provides 400 jobs. The US Steel in its high days used to provide 170,000 jobs. So the problem here is that the high-tech, we do need them, but they don't solve all the problems either. But it's much better to have them than not to have them. So, my recommendation would be, don't sell your family silver, don't sell the seed potatoes, don't fall in the trap of Mr. Asluns and become another Russia. Thank you.